you have freedom to present however you want. Please just say if you want people to interrupt you during this talk, or save the questions for later, etc. Okay, great. So yes, during today's talk, I'm very happy to welcome Lorna Quandt from Gallaudet University. Lorna is the director of the Action and Brain Lab, and which she founded in early 2016. She has a BA in psychology from Haverford College and a PhD in psychology, which she did at Temple University. And what I found really interesting is that Lorna told me that she's also pursuing the development of a research-based educational technology to create new ways to learn sign languages. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation to present at this lab talk series, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about it.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to chat with this group. Of course, I've done some looking around on the lab website and looking over some of your recent work, and I'm really interested in a certain type of expertise, and I know that you're all interested in a certain type of expertise, so I think we'll be able to find some sort of common areas, and I'm really looking forward to hearing any questions or comments. So I have slides, of course, and I have data to show you, but I'm happy to stop at any time for clarifying questions or any other comments or questions. We can keep it casual. So anytime, just say something and I will be happy to take your questions. So like Dr. Ramon mentioned, I will be talking about the enhanced perception and cognition in deaf sign language users. I have EEG and behavioral work, and I will also give you a little taste at the end about this educational technology development that I'm doing. So we can jump right in, and before I share the research questions, I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and the populations that I am interested in. So I work at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., which is a small university. Oh, I'm getting a little auditory loop.
Okay, I think someone just unmuted. I just muted them. Sorry, Young.
No problem. Gallaudet University is really a unique place. It is the world's premier university dedicated to deaf and hard of hearing students. So when I started working at Gallaudet, I came because I had an expertise in the neuroscience of how people perceive and produce actions, particularly hand actions. But at that time, I had not yet studied anything about sign language. So the goal was for me to start a new research agenda using what I know from cognitive neuroscience to sort of inform questions about sign language. So I've now been there for about 5.5 years, and I have just started to chip away at some of those questions about how we can use sort of action perception frameworks to learn new things about sign language and the people who use sign language. So at Gallaudet, almost all of my colleagues, students, and people who work in my lab are deaf, and we use sign language about all of this work. So that's where we're coming from. And today I'll just overview that we will talk a little bit about what the big questions are. Then I'm going to show you data from a few different studies. And because I'm showing you things from multiple studies, I'm not going to go really deep into the methods of each one, but I'm more than happy to answer questions or take a little more time on any of the particular slides that you have questions about. So why would I, as a person who's interested in expertise like hand movement expertise or body movement expertise, why would I want to study sign language? And particularly before I started work at Gallaudet, I was interested in sort of spatial cognition. So, of the many different forms of cognition, one involves understanding how to represent and transform things in space. So sign language is an incredibly spatial and complex way of communicating. So this is American Sign Language, which is what we use at Gallaudet and across this country, but many, many, many hundreds of different sign languages exist across the world. They all share highly spatial and highly rule-based use of space, which I found to be particularly interesting and particularly understudied. As well, you can see that sign language requires an incredibly complex production and perception of rule-based hand, finger, body, and face movements. So underlying all of the work that I'll present here today is my question, which is, for people who really are fluent or expert at producing and perceiving sign language, even people who grew up with sign language as a first language, what else might be going on in their brains as a result of knowing such a, intricate and complex mode of manual communication? And until very recently, most of the cognitive neuroscience questions surrounding sign language were of a psycholinguistic nature. So what can we learn about the grammar and the semantics of sign language through neuroscience? And that's incredibly interesting, but my interest is really more about their visual and spatial cognition and perception. So a little bit of a new take on using neuroscience to learn more.
Just a quick comment, Lorna. We can see your entire desktop, in which the presentation window is slightly smaller. So I'm not sure if this was intentional. Just in case it wasn't, I just thought I'd point it out. Yeah. No,
that's helpful. I wonder if I'm going to try and just make it all fully. Let's see if that works. Yes? Okay, great. Okay, so to summarize why we would study expert signers, sign languages are produced on the body and spatially complex and three-dimensional, which I think sets them up as a, much needed form of communication and cognition to study if one is interested in human actions and gestures. So from prior work unrelated to sign language, we already know that being highly experienced with a form of action can change how you later perceive similar actions and can maybe change how you perceive other types of actions as well. So one classic study that is along these lines is that people who are expert trained ballet dancers, when you put them in a fMRI scanner and you show them videos of people dancing ballet compared to doing capoeira dance moves, you see more engagement in the sensory and motor cortices for ballerinas watching ballet as compared to ballerinas watching equivalently matched capoeira dance. And there's, as some of you might know, there's like a huge literature in this area. What has changed in perception by having experience with certain types of actions? But this kind of research has never really touched signers, people who are expert in this particular system of communication, whichever sign language they use in their home country. We've never really looked at the same types of questions in sign language users, which I would argue should be done because sign language users, if they're native signers, are producing and perceiving sign language every day, all day. Potentially most of their communication might take place in sign language, so the depth and complexity of their experiences is very great. So I'll jump into a few studies that I've run in my lab in the past few years. These studies cover EEG methods, some behavioral work, and when I present the EEG methods and results, I'm happy to stop and engage on any questions just so I can clarify and make sure that what I'm going over is well understood. So my question looking at sign imitation is the question of whether ASL experience, American Sign Language experience, might change sensory motor involvement in sign processing. So this is sort of taking like a embodied cognition view related to like the ballet and capoeira dancers. Basically, are people who are expert signers perceiving sign language differently, perhaps with greater engagement of their sensory motor cortices. Or in contrast, they could be perceiving it more efficiently with less recruitment of sensory motor cortices. So this had not yet been studied. The data that I based this work on includes a couple of very basic facts about sign language and about motor production. So on the left, you can see two different types of signs. And in any sign language, you'll have some signs that are produced with only one hand, like here, plane is produced with one hand. And some signs are produced with two hands. So street is produced with two hands. We also have some neuroimaging data that shows us from producing those signs one-handed compared to two-handed signs, we know that there's sort of a basic fact about the human sensory motor system. And you can see here that the right sensory motor cortex is more greatly involved for two-handed signs because if you have a right-handed signer and you're producing a right-handed sign, then the left hemisphere is controlling that. Whereas if you're producing a two-handed sign, you have more bilateral involvement. So these are sort of basic facts upon which I built this study. The methods that I'll use for this study and a few of my other projects I'll discuss today look at sensory motor EEG. So as you can tell from what I've talked about so far today, I have a lot of interest in the sensory motor engagement involved in watching actions. So one way that we can measure that, aside from the possibility of doing fMRI scanning where we see highly spatial information but not much timing detail, is using EEG. So by using EEG to look at sensory motor involvement, the long story short on how we do that is by extracting the power in alpha, mu, and beta EEG rhythms over the primary sensory and motor cortices of the brain, so over the central strip in particular. And we know from lots of prior work that lower alpha and beta power over that central region indicate more activity in the sensory motor cortex. So I'll be showing time frequency responses like shown in this figure to the lower right, where typically a blue color indicates a lower power in that time and in that frequency on that graph. So just to orient you. For this first study, my hypothesis was that when fluent ASL users see one-handed or two-handed signs, the signs will be simulated in the sensory motor system. So this is sort of, again, a very basic question based on what we already know about sign production. If this is the case, we would expect to see differences in sensory motor system activity for one-handed and two-handed signs, particularly more for deaf signers as compared to folks who do not know sign language. So we ran a study that had an ASL imitation task with some hearing non-signers and some deaf fluent signers. It was a simple task. They saw one-handed or two-handed signs, and then when those were finished, they were asked to produce their own imitation of the sign they had just seen. And something to keep in mind is that if you're deaf and you're a signer in this experiment, this is a very simple task. It's like hearing the word cat and being required to say the word cat. It's just word imitation. If you're hearing, this is actually a little bit of a complicated task. You're copying new, potentially complex gestures that you've never seen after only one repetition. So someone shows you this, and then you have to do that immediately after. So anecdotally, we noticed that most of our hearing participants were a little bit stressed by this task. Like it was sort of outside of their comfort zone. So I'll show you what our results look like from this. And our main comparison here is comparing observation of a one-handed sign to observation of a two-handed sign. For hearing non-signers, what we see is, can you see my mouse if I'm moving over the picture?
No. Yes, I can.
Yes, okay. So we have time 0 here, which is the time at which the sign starts. It's sort of a sign onset when the hands touch each other or when they reach their initial location is time 0. And then we have starting down at the bottom, this is alpha range up to beta range. You can see that for hearing non-signers, they are differentiating between one and two-handed signs. That's the significance that we see in this right third most panel. And I'll show you in comparison what we see for deaf sign language users. So comparing between the one-handed and two-handed signs, we see for deaf signers, we see earlier and more consistent differentiation between those one-handed and two-handed signs. And this data is from a central parietal electrode over the midline, but this pattern was found at several central sensory motor regions. We took this as some evidence that there is earlier and more robust differentiation in deaf signers compared to hearing non-signers who did show sensory motor differentiation, but later and not as robust. Any particular questions about this data I have on screen? Okay. So from that study, which of course had more results, that's one exhibit of a result from that, we do see that ASL experience changes sensory motor involvement in sign processing. And like I have set up so far, to me, this was a really basic question. There's nothing particularly surprising or complex going on here, but sort of mirroring some of the work from other aspects of the action literature, showing that experience with sign language does change how you see signs. So let's move on to something that's different and seeing an effect of sign language upon something other than just seeing sign language. So this is about reading. If you read the word at the top, cat, if you know English, it is very possible that in some way you're sort of simulating or hearing, like imagining that you're hearing the word spoken cat. That's a whole body of literature that suggests that there may be some amount of like simulation of words that we read. If you're deaf and you're reading, my question was, do deaf readers simulate the signs that match the English word they're reading? So if a deaf reader reads the word cat, is their mind simulating the production of that sign with one hand, making this sign for cat? So that was the question that motivated this second study. And this is a nice match with the first study I presented because it is based on similar foundational information. When fluent ASL users read the word heart and the word warm, if you don't know ASL, those words are just heart and warm. They're just words. But if you know ASL, you know that heart is formed with two hands, drawing a heart over your chest, and warm is signed with one hand. So the question is, if ASL users are reading these two types of words, are the signs simulated in their sensory motor system? If so, we would expect to see differences in that sensory motor system activity for words that have one-handed compared to two-handed translations. So the research question is whether ASL experience changes sensory motor activity even when reading English. So what I just popped onto the screen is the data from hearing non-signers. And we have in the leftmost column, oh gosh, what was that? Okay. In the leftmost column, we have one-handed words. So those are reading English words that happen to have one-handed ASL translations. And then reading two-handed words, English words that have two-handed translations. Then we have the differences on the right in these green panels. And thankfully, for hearing non-signers, there's no difference between these two lists of words. For a non-signer, they're just words. However, for deaf signers, we see what we predicted. So this is significant differences to some extent in the alpha or mu rhythm range, and more particularly in the beta rhythm range, showing that there was differentiation between one-handed and two-handed words during this task. And the task that they were completing was like a distractor task. They were simply counting the number of animal words they saw and reporting that at the end of a block. So there was no active reference to ASL during this task at all. It was just a word reading task. And this effect was seen at several electrodes over the frontal and sensory motor regions of the EEG array. So we take this as evidence that ASL experience does change sensory motor activity during reading, suggesting that deaf signers are simulating the physical properties of signs when reading English. So these two studies that I have mentioned so far suggest that being deaf or using sign language might contribute to different ways of seeing or even different ways of reading, but I felt like there are other types of perception that I was very curious whether that expertise with sign language would transfer out of that domain into other domains. And this is where I think the results and the studies that I have are particularly resonant with the work of your lab, looking at how unique special cases, special groups of people might see things differently than the rest of us. So now we'll talk about signers seeing movement in general. So before we already discussed signers seeing sign-related movements, but let's break away from seeing signs and think about other types of movement processing. So one thing that you may have noticed in the video that I showed at the beginning is that when people are signing with each other, as you see like in this circle of friends who are chatting, you are not always seeing and communicating with someone who's facing you directly, one-on-one faces forward. When we learn sign language, like when I have taken sign language instruction, we are always sort of face to face, the clearest possible way of seeing each other, the best possible view. But that's not how people interact in the real world when they're really communicating. When they're really communicating, people might see their friend signing from right next to them. Of course, there's a limit to how much you can, see at an angle, but signers have, I noticed anecdotally, have very sort of wide and flexible ways of communicating and perceiving, especially if they are fluent or native sign language users. So while I, as a person who's learning sign language, might need that sort of face-forward view in order to clearly see everything, my deaf colleagues and students who are fluent and perhaps native signers don't need that, particularly clear view. They can extract the meaningful information that they need to, despite distance, despite being at a strange angle. So it was this kind of life experience that I had at Gallaudet that made me think maybe deaf signers can also extract meaningful information from movement, even when it's not particularly easy to see, and particularly at strange, sort of non-standard angles. But I wanted to see whether this would expand or transfer outside of the domain of sign language. So we're fortunate to have a full motion capture recording studio in one of the labs that I work in. And so we used this setup to create some stimuli, which were point light display stimuli. So we had markers on each joint of the model's body. And he performed 6 different actions, which we were able to record at multiple angles. So we have some point light display recordings that are very easy to see. So I'll show you one of the ones that I think is very easy. So that's someone doing jumping jacks. And typically people report that that's not complicated to parse. You can see what's happening. We also created these stimuli, which are filmed from a more oblique angle. So the same types of actions, but just viewed differently. And I'm not sure, how exactly you feel you can process that, but a lot of people report that this one, you can get what is happening, but it's not quite as apparent and not quite as easy to parse as this straightforward jumping jacks. So we use these stimuli to ask, does ASL experience impact biological motion perception, especially when the movements are a little bit difficult to see? And that is sort of an added on question, in part because so much of the research on biological motion perception, especially any that has been done with sign language users, has really focused on like walking. So extracting walking from an array of moving dots, things like that. But I wanted to add more complexity to this type of task. So we have these stimuli which have 6 actions like jumping jacks and underarm throwing like you saw before.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I interrupt? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, it's only that maybe it's only me, but I think I don't see the right slide. I have issue with the update of the slide. Is only me?
Let's see. What can you tell me what you do see right now?
Yeah, now I see the point light and the jumping jacks, and yeah.
Okay, with different angles.
Yeah,
Yes.
with the different angles. Now, yes, yeah, I was stuck on the one before with the.
Okay. Can anyone tell me if they missed the stimuli? I can play them again. Does anyone need me to play them again?
If you can, for me, it would be great.
Sure. Okay, so I won't talk it over again as much, but we can see the person doing jumping jacks, the sort of easy to see. Hopefully everyone can see that video. And then the more complex action like this. Okay, did everyone see those?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So we had these 18 biological motion stimuli from different perspectives, and then we scrambled the movement on those to have control stimuli. And the task question that we started out with was a behavioral question, just to get a sense of how people felt about watching these stimuli. So we asked a large group of hearing people and a smaller group of deaf people. The deaf folks did know sign language. The hearing folks did not know sign language. We asked them, how difficult was it to distinguish what the person is doing for each of those 18 videos? And this is self-reported effort. So, that is, of course, a very subjective measure, but we wanted to add this information about what people felt. So we did find a highly significant difference between self-reported ratings. On average, this is on a rating scale of 1 to 9. So on average, people felt like they could distinguish what the actions were. Accuracy was pretty high, but reported effort was significantly lower for the deaf group compared to the hearing group. And when you break down the data, by each of the different actions, you can see that there are a few particular stimuli which there were very large differences for. So particular stimuli that hearing folks who don't know sign language were struggling with more, whereas the deaf signers reported less effort in distinguishing those. So this was sort of a descriptive self-report on those stimuli to guide the further investigations. We ran an EEG study asking how many of the actions that you saw in this block involve a ball. So half of our actions, like a golf swing or I forget what else, but like a basketball throw would involve a ball, and half of them wouldn't involve a ball. So it was just a way for them to sort of attend to what they were seeing and try to parse out what the action was. So we had, again, the main comparison between scrambled and biological motions. And then in the right panel here, we have the significant differences in time frequency responses to those scrambled and biological motions. For hearing non-signers, across the scalp, they do show different sensory motor responses to scrambled and biological, but they are not particularly strong, and they're also occurring mostly in the theta EEG band and not like we predicted in the alpha or beta EEG band. So this is hearing non-signers discriminating between those two types of point light displays. And here we can see the deaf signers. And I will note that our deaf signers in this study were all so-called native signers who grew up using sign language as their first language. So typically these are folks who are deaf, who were born to deaf parents often. And so they have some of the most fluent, most fluid, and most highest levels of skill with perceiving and producing sign language. So our deaf signers in this group are a more expert and lifelong experience with sign language. So we see for deaf signers significant differences in alpha and beta responses to these scrambled and biological motions, starting pretty early and continuing on a little bit more consistently. So we saw these effects in the B panel over here. You can see we saw these same patterns across the entire sensory motor strip. From this data, we conclude that there is a sort of enhanced differentiation in deaf signers in response to these stimuli, which are just sort of these everyday actions. And deaf signers are showing this earlier and more consistent differentiation, paired with the self-report that they had less effort exerted to identify the actions. For this study, we also ran a more exploratory intertrial coherence analysis. And what we found, and this was completely exploratory, so what I want to do is follow up on this and design a study particularly looking into this question. Again, the panels are laid out the same. So for hearing non-signers, this is the response to the scrambled displays, the response to biological, and this is the significant difference between the two. So there's nothing special going on with their intertrial coherence here. For the deaf signers, we see a lot of striking differences between scrambled and biological theta burst of ITC at about 500 milliseconds following the onset of the video. And so this was unexpected, but it suggests that the deaf signers are more readily identifying and retrieving perhaps memory-based information about what they're seeing on the screen. So if you imagine the task that they're doing, they're seeing the moving dots, half of which are not a coherent action at all. but half of which are an action, and they need to count how many require a ball. So they're seeing these and trying to match them or map them onto known actions, known things that they have experienced themselves. So this theta ITC, more exploratory, does suggest that there's something there in this very immediate processing that is particularly salient to the deaf signers, looking at the biological motions. Before I move on from this, does anyone have any questions while we're looking at these slides? Okay. So again, from those studies, the conclusion at this time is that there is some evidence for enhanced differentiation in deaf signers. And so we can say that ASL experience does impact biological motion perception. Although that comes with some caveats. For instance, the question that people always ask is, how can we differentiate the state of being deaf from sign language experience? The answer is, so far in these studies, we can't really differentiate between those, but we know what we would need to do in order to differentiate. I would run the same study on hearing native signers. So there are plenty of folks, especially people around Gallaudet, who are hearing and have full use of their hearing sense, but they were born to deaf family, so they used ASL growing up. At Gallaudet, often we have interpreters who are working at Gallaudet who are from that situation. Their parents are deaf. So if we study hearing folks who are very fluent in sign language, that would inform this. As well, we could study deaf signers who did not sign from an early age, perhaps cochlear implant users or other folks who did not have access to learning a sign language from a young age. So if we ran those populations, we would be able to better differentiate the effect of sign language use from the state of being deaf, which right now is not a well-characterized differentiation. Okay, I have a little bit of a bonus on some very, very recent work that is hot off the presses. Looking at a different kind of perception. So again, we're going to use those point light displays. But the question here is about how different kinds of information affect someone's ability to see finger spelling. So if you don't know, in a sign language, a lot of what is produced are particular signs that represent concepts or ideas, but sometimes, for instance, spelling someone's name or spelling a proper noun, you will use finger spelling to produce the letters from your alphabet to sort of translate them directly into a signed form. So my name in ASL finger spelling looks like that. So finger spelling is a really, really interesting phenomenon for me because it's super complex, super fast, and for me, as a person who has been learning ASL for just a few years, it is by far one of the most challenging things to perceive. So when other people are finger spelling, it can very easily just look like a blur of finger movement. And it has taken a lot of training and practice on my part to be able to successfully parse most of what people are spelling when they're finger spelling. So it's a super, super tricky thing to perceive. And so we created this set of stimuli and designed this experiment to sort of probe the limits of how people can perceive finger spelling. And I'll show you how we looked at both features of the finger spelling itself and how semantic information can affect that perception. As well, you see in the blue how language background factors into this. So one's experience with ASL must be related to how well they perceive finger spelling, but we wanted to characterize that. So we created these point light display stimuli, but this time there's something different. We are having the model finger spell city names, and some of the city names are real places like Barcelona, and some are pseudo places. They're not real. We used like a name generator and we picked some that sort of sounded like they might be real places, but they're not real places. So we also varied the number of markers on the hand. In the high condition on the left, you can see even when they're at rest, there are more markers on the hand. I believe we had one marker at every joint on the finger. Whereas for the low number condition, we only had a couple of markers on each finger. So it's more sparse amount of information. I'll show you what the stimuli look like. In both of these cases, the signer is producing the same sign or the same name. They're spelling Barcelona. So take a look at the high fidelity, high number of markers. I'll play it again. And you can see the fingers moving pretty well. And here we have the same exact production, but half of the markers have been removed. So those two comparisons, or that comparison, probes the role of how much information is in the finger spelling that you see. You could see finger spelling stimuli with many markers or a few markers. How does that affect the accuracy of perception? And then because we have some real place names and some fake place names, we can also vary the extent to which a person can rely on their outside knowledge. So if you're taking if you're doing our experiment online, which is how we ran it, the task is to write into a box, what city name did you see? So if you see the ones that I just showed you and you know some ASL, you might kind of like get that it's Barcelona, even if you missed a few letters. You can use your outside world information to fill in those letters. You can't do that with the fake places. You have to actually see every letter. So what we found is from 273 ASL users, these were all people who used ASL with a variety of expertise levels and from deaf, hearing, and hard of hearing groups. Across the board, earlier ASL acquisition, so learning it earlier in life, is highly correlated to higher accuracy on this task. So that's not surprising, but it does match with what we predicted. And here I'll break down, you can see accuracy is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have pseudo places like Hilopolis and real places like Barcelona. You see different lines for deaf looking at the high number of markers, deaf looking at the low number of markers, and then the hard of hearing and hearing groups again looking at high and low number of markers. So this one figure shows all of those comparisons that I went over before. We see across the board a strong effect with the rather large effect size of real places being easier to see than pseudo places. So people are relying on their semantic world knowledge to complete this task. And we see that higher number of markers is significantly easier, more likely to be accurately perceived compared to a low number of markers. And of course, you can see that our deaf group was the most likely to be accurate compared to our hearing groups and the hard of hearing group. Okay, before I get to interim conclusions, does anyone have any questions while I have this data up? Okay. So interim conclusions, we see that deaf signers show embodied processing of signs. They also simulate signs when they're reading English, and they show enhanced responses to biological motion. And those newest results I just showed you, we can characterize some of how they perceive this complex finger spelling stimuli. What I'll do for a couple more minutes, I have some open questions here. Like I alluded to, deafness compared to sign language experience is sort of tricky to separate out at this point. We also haven't looked deeply into the effects of age. Looking at this along a developmental trajectory would be interesting because it's such a big question as to when people are exposed to sign languages. And because I'm here with you all today, I also feel like there are a lot of open questions about other types of perception, particularly facial expressions. Anecdotally, all the deaf people that I know who I've talked about this with feel like deaf folks are particularly good at reading and understanding facial expressions, but that has not really been backed up by the literature yet to date. So that's sort of an unexplored avenue that I am interested in. I'm going to show you just for about 2 minutes the work that Dr. Ramon alluded to, where basically we're taking what we know about educational neuroscience. How can people learn and process new information in ways that are really brain-based and related to what we know about the learning brain? If we take those questions of education and neuroscience and apply them to trying to develop new ways of learning American Sign Language, where do we land? I landed on trying to develop a way for people to learn sign language in immersive virtual reality. So this is a whole new way of trying to teach American Sign Language, and it relates to the work that I have described so far today, in that it really tries to harness the idea of embodied learning. So sign language is a highly embodied form of communication. So how can we use immersive virtual reality to really capitalize on that and create great ways to learn? So I'll just describe what we have done while I show you this little short demo video. Basically, people put on a virtual reality headset. The screen there is showing what the user is seeing in their headset, and for them it feels like a fully immersive three-dimensional environment. They're standing in front of a teacher character who's teaching simple ASL introductory signs, and you can see that the user produces those signs and their hands are shown in front of them. So we are using the three-dimensional space between the teacher and the student to try and represent the signs. What you saw in that video was a proof of concept from about a year or a year and a half ago, before the pandemic. We have recently received funding to extend this project for the next few years with more content and more options, adding new features like hand tracking and feedback, and evaluating how the system works. So how will it work to change how people understand sign language? So that's what I have for you today. I have, of course, funders and people to thank, and you can find me at the places on the lower right. But I'm happy to answer any questions or just hear from you all any thoughts or ideas you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quandt. Thanks a lot. That was amazing. Fantastic. Oh, Anna already beat me to the chase. So Anna, you're definitely the first to go. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, I don't have the camera. So really interesting talk. Thanks. I really like the experimental design and also the final part. Really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the biological motion experiment that you did. And I have just a question. I was wondering if there are proof or evidence that deaf people also have increased performance in like global motion perception or just random motion responses.
Mm-hmm. So from my understanding of that literature, I have not done that research myself, but It seems that in general with motion processing, there are particular advantages in detecting motion if you're a deaf signer on the periphery. So on the very edges of the visual field, it seems that deaf signers do have greater attention to motion and greater sensitivity to motion, but not in the foveal central area. So their distribution of attention is shifted compared to non-signers. And my interpretation based on what I've read is consistent with what I understand about sign language is, especially if you're a deaf signer, being highly attentive to what's happening right on the edge of your periphery is very important, because as a hearing person, if there's something on the edge of my periphery that I need to attend to, I often have audio cues to that as well. But if you don't have the audio cue, you want to, your brain is maximizing its efficiency by being a little more attentive to what's happening right on the edge. And for the foveal perception of motion, I think that's really interesting. It's not enhanced in deaf signers. And my best explanation for that is that I understand when we are signing with each other, so I'm signing with my colleagues or my students, as you become more proficient in signing, you learn to look less directly at a person's hands that are moving, and you attempt to achieve a more holistic view, particularly focusing on the person's face and allowing their hand movements to remain in the periphery of your view. So if that makes sense, when someone is learning to sign, often they'll look at the person's hands, they'll really attend to the hands, and that is not efficient, and it is not how real signers look. Real signers look right at your eyes and they see what's happening down here without moving their eyes to look. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, it's yeah, I can see the difference between fovea and periphery. I was also wondering if it could be that they are better in recognizing global biological motion versus scramble, for instance, because they are also better in motion perception per se, or if it's something that is more related to retrieval of movement and more frontal aspect, let's say. Because you have the opposite, like for instance, autism, they have an issue with biological motion, and they have less performance in global motion perception. So I start now to wonder what was the mechanism basically.
Now that we have completed this one study with the biological motion stimuli, I find that I have more questions than I do answers. So that is one of them. So I would like to use the same stimuli, but compare them to other types of motion, and also learn more about whether it's, is it more about it being a human biological motion or more about it being a coherent motion in general? And how specific is it to the biological nature of it compared to the general motion characteristics? There's a lot that is remaining to be learned about that.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Great question.
Really nice. Yeah, I didn't know if also did that. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? I'll let everyone else ask before I get to mine. Purnima, please go ahead.
Hi, this was a very interesting talk since I hadn't come across research in these topics before, so it was very enlightening. What I'm going to ask might be very superficial, but I just wanted to understand if there can be applications to the research that you've presented today, how you can develop new technologies to better teach sign language to new users. I just wanted to understand from that perspective.
So from what perspective? Let me understand your question a little bit more. You're curious about the developing technology for sign language use. Do you mean related to the work I showed at the very end?
Yes.
Okay. So basically what we wanted to, this is like I have two tracks of research that are theoretically connected, but they are sort of different in practice. The one is learning about what is different when in cognition and perception when people know sign language, and the other is sort of taking that information about the embodied and visual spatial nature of sign language to then create these new ways of learning. So we have been developing this one particular virtual reality system for learning VR or for learning ASL, based on the foundation of understanding certain facts about how people learn actions the best, you know, by making sure that there's iterative like turn taking between two people, and making sure that people can see things in 3 dimensions rather than seeing flat 2D videos. So we're trying to leverage the cognitive neuroscience information about learning ASL into practice to make it happen. I'm happy to, at any time, if people want to follow up more about any questions, you can always find me on email. Happy to chat.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, then I'll just go right ahead. Right. So first of all, I just have to say again that I really enjoyed the talk, and it's so interesting because, you know, obviously you work in such a different domain, and that's why I'm really delighted to see such a high degree of overlap. Even just, you know, the way that you started saying that from your life experience, deaf signers, you know, can extract information under difficult conditions at a distance. This is totally in keeping with the anecdotal experiences that, you know, I receive from the so-called super recognizers, so in a completely different domain. So I do think that there's a large degree of overlap. And also, interestingly, the first part of your talk, when you were talking about the alpha and beta responses in the deaf signers and them being more like finding earlier and more consistent differentiation in deaf signers. It's interesting that you say that you mentioned consistency, because this has been increasingly like an aspect that has been popping up regardless of what type of paradigms or experiments we see. That it's not so much absolute magnitude of information that's used, et cetera, or which type of information. It's the way that people process information, and it's the consistency thereof. So I think that's a really interesting feature that I think probably in many domains has been overlooked. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this consistency aspect before I get to my second question.
I mean, I love that question. No one has ever asked me about that before, but I do think it's an important feature of this work. Like, one reason that I use EEG as opposed to other measures is because I can get more information about what happens as something is unfolding. So a lot of action perception research does use fMRI, but there is a very vibrant world of EEG action perception. Because of the very nature of an action, it has a start and it has a finish, and things happen during that time. Much like, you know, a lot of spoken language research is also EEG for the same reason. Because we can see more about the unfolding dynamics from start to finish. And like you said, it's just not an absolute measure of, you know, this group had bigger response than this group had. But we see something, especially if we see these differences in like consistency across many trials and across many electrodes. It's like, it's not that for 1 second there was just a burst of more information. It's that there's a different pattern of the ongoing processing. And we can see, even, I won't go back so many slides back, but we can see when we look very detailed at the timing from some of my work, the differences in deaf signers are occurring before the so-called onset of the sign. So the onset of the sign, if I was signing wedding, the onset would be the moment that my hands touch. but before my hands touch, there's still information there. So we can see that before the onset, deaf signers are already coding that information a certain way, and then it continues as they see the sign. And I find that to be meaningful information, not just saying, you know, look at this 5 seconds, there's more in this one group. But yeah, I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, I think really like looking at the way that processes unfold and how they do so consistently within individual observers as a measure of their ability. I think it's a very interesting way to also track changes in learning, you know, thinking about perceptual learning. You know, one other question that I had was like, do you think the deaf signers would exhibit greater plasticity for other types of perceptual learning? I don't know if you've ever looked at any aspects related to that question.
I have not personally, but yeah, I mean, I think that it's really untapped right now as to other than seeing and learning sign language or seeing differences in sign language perception, what else is different in deaf native signers? I think we've only begun to crack open the idea that growing up using sign language as your primary form of communication makes people, you know, develop in different ways. And I think that for a long time that was not studied much because it ran the risk of having a negative tone. You know, people who grow up signing don't have blah, 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 blah. But that's not my perspective. I want to see what they do have. And I can, you know, I showed you in the talk today that there are these skills that they do have above and beyond people who don't sign. So yes, I think, you know, the plasticity of, I think you said the plasticity of other perceptual domains. Yes, I mean, I think there's a lot. Spatial perception, we've done some work on like mental rotation is enhanced with greater sign language abilities. So I think there's a lot of visual spatial types of tasks that if we look a little closer, we would see maybe a greater flexibility or a different approach. You know, it's not always just like which group is better, but does growing up using sign language change how you're processing, regardless of better or worse, but just what's the difference?
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. Like I've always considered the classical view in neuropsychology on focusing on impairments and omitting the benefits to be very frustrating. And likewise, when you're thinking about highly performant observers, I don't know, be it chess players, memory champions, or whatever, all good things also come at a cost. So I would always turn my interest to the flip side of it, regardless of whether we're talking about an impairment or something that's very efficient. So I think that's really interesting. And then, sorry if I'm hijacking the questions. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand. I will stop. And then after you went into the second part of the talk, immediately this question popped up in my mind if you had done any type of psychophysical experiments where you like more parametrically manipulated the type of measures that you're looking at. And then you brought this, the point like, the markers, you know, the number of markers basically during the signing of the alphabet, let's say. Sorry if I'm not repeating this correctly. So that kind of spoke to that question. But yeah, I was wondering whether there is a way to parametrically change the amount of information that is available so that you can, for instance, distinguish without knowing how proficient a deaf signer is, like whether you could be able to categorize them. Let's say that you manipulate the amount of markers that are available, and based on their ability profile, you could then backtrack on how long have they been learning sign language, etc.
I love that idea. And I think, so the finger spelling study that you saw with these varied numbers of markers, that was like a totally pandemic driven study where we were like, oh no, we can't do any EEG research. Like, what should we do? we had these stimuli made already. So we ran a big online study. And I think what we found that I showed you today is already very convincing and interesting. But now that we have that data, I just want to run more studies with it. And I really like your idea of sort of backtracking. So almost testing out the idea of using that as a marker or not a benchmark, but like a way to get a sense of someone's abilities, and then we could backpedal and see if that matches other ways of testing their abilities. But I like that idea a lot. I think with these stimuli, there are a lot of possible routes to go down, and I do want to drill more into the psychophysics and like I've looked at sort of big differences so far, and I'm more interested in parsing out some of the finer details now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because it would be very easy to at least manipulate two very simple measures or metrics. So the number of the markers, but also the velocity at which, it's really easy to speed that up and then see how the conjunction of both of those things.
Yeah.
Because this is exactly, the type of thoughts that I have when I'm thinking about the super recognizers as well. And it's also interesting that you mentioned the facial expressions, because I was briefly part of a project that then I had pulled out from, where Matt Dye and Olivier Pascalis were also involved, where they were looking at categorization. They said recognition, but I would refer to it as categorization of facial expressions in deaf signers, and I believe that they found no difference. But because of the anecdotal things that you mentioned with the greater sensitivity at a distance, etc., I would even go further and say I would not even focus on facial expressions, but I would look at facial identity, because especially the peripheral enhancement, let's say, in sensitivity, would be beneficial to processing low spatial frequency information, which is very important for facial identity decoding, etc. So I think, if you're interested, there's definitely a large degree of overlap, and we could definitely talk offline, not for the others who are still here.
I think that would be really interesting to follow up on, because I've seen a little bit of literature showing like no difference in face perception. And I think those studies are valid, but I think they're also not encapsulating the full range of, like, all of my students and colleagues are like, no, like, we see things in faces that we don't think you see. And I'm like, okay, we need to test that. We can't just sit around seeing, debating that. But I think you're right that maybe facial identity would yield some interesting things. So yeah, maybe we can follow up on that.
Because it's such a difficult task, and it makes me also think of, like, the same way the facial expression theory of, everything being culturally universal, the Ekman and Friesen stuff. And then it was very, quickly, like Rachel Jack has done amazing work on this, showing that if you look at the dynamics, there are differences. And yeah, so I think it's always a matter of the perspective that we take and the likelihood of us finding potential differences. And I think listening to our subjects is always a good idea.
Yeah, getting ideas from real world experience has been really, really rich. I'm an interesting case in that once I took this job 5 years ago, I started being my own research subject, when you jump in and you're doing the thing you're studying. So I have a lot of perspectives on that have been informed by the people I work with and around. So it can be very valuable.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Last chance.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and thank you for a great discussion. Anyone feel free to find me online or email me, whatever you want. This was really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll stop the recording, send it over to you afterwards. And thank you, everyone, for being here.